The machine gun had been firing for 3 hours straight. The barrel glowed orange in the darkness, so hot that rainwater hissed into steam when it touched the metal. Sergeant John Basilone's hands were blistered and bleeding, wrapped in torn cloth to keep gripping the weapon. Around him in the mud lay the bodies of his gun crew, all dead. The Japanese kept coming. It was the night of October 24th, 1942, on Guadalcanal, and the entire Japanese assault was focused on this single ridge south of Henderson Field. They had been promised the Americans would break. The Marines were starving, sick with malaria, outnumbered 4-1. Intelligence reports said they could barely stand, let alone fight. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But nobody had told John Basilone that he was supposed to break. And for the next 15 hours, he would prove that one Marine with enough ammunition and enough anger could hold a line that an entire platoon should have defended. This is the story of how desperation, improvisation, and sheer refusal to die created one of the most lethal defensive positions in Marine Corps history. In the autumn of 1942, the United States Marine Corps on Guadalcanal was fighting 2 wars, one against the Japanese, one against the island itself. The Japanese they could see, could shoot at, could kill. The island was different. The island killed slowly through hunger and disease and exhaustion that ground men down until they were hollow shells of who they'd been. Henderson Field was the prize everyone was dying for. A dirt airstrip carved out of coconut groves, it was the only operational American airfield in the South Pacific Combat Zone. Whoever controlled Henderson Field controlled the air. Whoever controlled the air would win Guadalcanal, and whoever won Guadalcanal would determine the course of the Pacific War. The Japanese knew this. In October 1942, they assembled their largest force yet to retake the airfield. More than 20,000 troops under Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake converged on the Marine positions. The plan was simple: overwhelm the Americans through sheer numbers. Attack at night when American firepower was less effective. Drive straight through the defenses and capture Henderson Field before dawn. Japanese commanders were confident. Their intelligence said the Marines were on the edge of collapse. Food supplies were critically low. Malaria and dysentery had hospitalized hundreds. The survivors were gaunt, feverish, barely functional. One more push, the Japanese believed, would shatter the American defense entirely. They were about to discover how wrong intelligence could be. John Basilone was 25 years old. Born November 4, 1916 in Buffalo, New York, he was the 6th of 10 children in an Italian immigrant to family. His father was a tailor. His mother raised the children and kept the household running on a working-class budget that left no room for waste. Basilone grew up tough in a neighborhood where you learned to fight or learned to hide, and hiding wasn't in his nature. He quit school after 8th grade, worked odd jobs, tried to find his place. At 18, he joined the army. He served 3 years in the Philippines with the 31st Infantry Regiment. The army taught him discipline, structure, how to follow orders, and how to shoot. When his enlistment ended in 1937, he came home to Raritan, New Jersey, where his family had moved. He worked as a caddie at a country club, drove a laundry truck, tried civilian life. It didn't fit. In July 1940, John Basilone walked into a Marine Corps recruiting office and enlisted. The Marines were different from the Army, harder, meaner, prouder. They demanded more and gave less. Basilone thrived. He completed boot camp at Paris Island, then went to Marine Corps Base Quantico for advanced training. The machine gun course changed everything. Basilone had fired rifles and pistols, but the Browning M 1917A, one machine gun, was something else entirely. Water-cooled, belt-fed, capable of sustained fire that could cut down entire formations. It weighed over 100 pounds with water and ammunition, required a crew of 3 to operate effectively, and could fire up to 600 rounds per minute. Most Marines saw machine guns as support weapons, something specialists handled. Basilone saw them as instruments of absolute firepower. He learned every component, every malfunction, every technique for keeping the weapon operational under the worst conditions. He could field strip the gun blindfolded, clear jams in seconds, replace barrels while under fire. His instructors noted his aptitude. More than that, they noted his attitude. Basilone didn't just learn the weapon, he became obsessed with it. He studied how to position machine guns for maximum effect, how to create interlocking fields of fire, how to calculate range and deflection by instinct rather than instruments. By the time he completed the course, Basilone was rated expert on the M1917, but expert was just a rating. What Basilone possessed was something deeper, an understanding of how machine guns changed infantry combat, how one properly positioned gun could stop an attack that rifles couldn't touch. He joined Company C, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines in 1941. His unit was stationed at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, then Camp Pendleton, California. Basilone was promoted to corporal, then sergeant. His platoon commander recognized his technical skill and made him a machine gun section leader. It was a position that required tactical judgment, not just mechanical competence. Basilone had to decide where to place his guns, how to integrate them with rifle squads, when to fire, and when to hold. He proved himself repeatedly in training exercises. While other section leaders positioned their guns by doctrine, Basilone positioned his by terrain and probable enemy approach routes. He studied maps obsessively, walked ground personally, identified every piece of cover and concealment. His guns were always in unexpected places, always covering gaps other commanders hadn't noticed. In May 1942, the 7th Marines deployed to Samoa. The regiment was tasked with defending American Samoa against potential Japanese invasion. It was garrison duty, but Basilone used the time to drill his section relentlessly. He made them practice loading ammunition in the dark, practice clearing jams while wearing gas masks, practice everything under the worst possible conditions. His men hated the training. Basilone didn't care. He told them that when combat came, they would be grateful for every repetition. In September 1942, the 7th Marines received orders to reinforce Guadalcanal. The 1st Marines who had landed in August were being ground down by attrition. Malaria, combat losses, and exhaustion had reduced their effective strength by nearly half. Fresh troops were desperately needed. The 7th Marines sailed from Samoa aboard transport ships, arriving at Guadalcanal on September 18th. As they came ashore at Lunga Point, Basilone got his first look at what the island had done to the men they were replacing. The 1st Marines were skeletal, their uniforms in rags, their eyes hollow with fever and exhaustion. One Marine told Basilone that the island would kill him before the Japanese got the chance. Basilone didn't believe that. He'd survived 3 years in the Philippines. He knew heat and mosquitoes. How bad could Guadalcanal be? He learned quickly. The jungle was worse than anything he'd experienced. The heat was suffocating, humidity so thick you could barely breathe. Mosquitoes came in clouds that covered every exposed inch of skin. Within a week, half of Basilone's section was sick with malaria. The disease hit suddenly. Men would wake up shivering despite the heat, their teeth chattering, their bodies racked with fever. By afternoon, the fever would spike to over 104 degrees. Men became delirious, couldn't stand, couldn't function. Quinine helped if you could keep it down, but many men vomited the pills immediately. Basilone stayed healthy through sheer stubbornness and maybe genetics. While his men shivered in their foxholes, he kept working. He positioned his 3 machine guns along the southern perimeter of Henderson Field. The position wasn't glamorous, just mud and sandbags and barbed wire stretched across a ridge that overlooked a grassy clearing. But Basilone understood the terrain's value. Any Japanese attack from the south would have to cross that clearing. His guns would have a clear field of fire with no obstructions for at least 200 yards. The position also had good drainage. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this, which meant the gun pits wouldn't flood during the afternoon rains that came almost daily. Good drainage meant the guns could be maintained properly. Rust was as much an enemy as bullets on Guadalcanal. Basilone inspected his weapons daily. He cleaned them obsessively, kept the barrels free of moisture, oiled every moving part. He stockpiled ammunition, stacking belts of 30-caliber rounds in covered pits behind each gun position. Other section leaders conserved ammunition, rationed it carefully. Basilone hoarded it. He scrounged extra belts from supply, traded cigarettes for more rounds, even stripped ammunition from damaged guns in the repair depot. By mid-October, Basilone had over 15,000 rounds stockpiled at his position. It was more ammunition than doctrine called for, more than most section leaders would request. But Basilone believed that in combat, you never had enough ammunition until you had more than you could possibly shoot. His platoon commander asked why he needed so much. Basilone replied simply that if the Japanese came in force, he wanted to still be shooting when the sun came up. The Japanese were definitely coming. Intelligence reports indicated a major attack was imminent. Captured documents revealed plans for a coordinated assault involving multiple regiments. The objective was Henderson Field. The timing was late October. American commanders prepared defensive positions, reinforced weak points, positioned artillery to provide supporting fire. On October 23rd, reconnaissance patrols reported large Japanese formations moving through the jungle south of the Marine lines. The attack would come soon, probably that night or the next. Basilone's platoon commander briefed the section. Enemy forces, estimated at brigade strength, possibly larger. Expect banzai charges, human wave attacks, designed to overwhelm positions through sheer numbers. The Marines would be outnumbered significantly. Their only advantage was firepower. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery would have to stop attacks that rifles couldn't handle alone. The commander looked at Basilone. His position was directly in the path of the probable main assault. If the Japanese came where intelligence predicted, Basilone's 3 guns would face the brunt of the attack. Could he hold? Basilone said yes without hesitation, but privately he knew the mathematics were grim. 3 machine guns, crews of 3 men each, against hundreds or thousands of attackers in darkness. The guns could fire 600 rounds per minute each, 1,800 total if all 3 fired simultaneously. But sustained fire would require barrel changes every few minutes. Water jackets would need refilling. Ammunition would need reloading. Any breakdown in crew coordination would reduce the rate of fire dramatically. Basilone spent October 24th preparing. He positioned his 3 guns in a triangular pattern, each covering approaches the others, couldn't see. He established ammunition resupply routes from the stockpile pits to each gun. He walked every foot of the terrain in daylight so he would know it in darkness. He identified landmarks, measured distances, calculated deflection points where he could fire indirectly if necessary. His crews watched him work. Some thought he was paranoid. Others recognized what he was doing. Basilone was preparing for the possibility that he might have to fight alone. If his crews were killed or wounded, if he was the only man left, he wanted to know he could still operate all 3 guns by himself. It seemed impossible. Operating 1 machine gun under combat stress was difficult enough. Operating 3 simultaneously was insane. But Basilone had a plan. He would fire 1 gun until the barrel overheated, then shift to the second while the first cooled. If necessary, he would move to the third. He would rotate between positions, keeping at least 1 gun firing at all times. It would require running through mud under fire, carrying belts of ammunition, working alone in darkness. It was a desperate plan born of worst-case thinking. By evening of October 24th, everything was ready. Ammunition was staged, water was stored for cooling, gun crews were in position. Basilone walked his line 1 final time, checking every detail. Then he settled into his foxhole behind the center gun and waited. The Japanese attacked at 9 p.m. The first wave came out of the jungle without warning, hundreds of men charging across the clearing toward Basilone's position. They were screaming, shouting, firing rifles from the hip. The sound was overwhelming, like nothing Basilone had ever heard. He opened fire immediately. The center machine gun roared, tracers cutting through the darkness. The Japanese ran straight into the fire. Men fell in rows, bodies piling up, but others kept coming. Basilone held the trigger, swept the gun left to right, back again. The belt of ammunition fed, through smoothly. Brass casings piled at his feet. To his left and right, the other two guns opened fire. The noise was deafening. 3 machine guns firing simultaneously created a wall of sound that drowned out everything else. The Japanese charge broke apart. Men went to ground, sought cover, tried to regroup. Basilone stopped firing, conserved ammunition. The barrel was smoking but not critical yet. His assistant gunner loaded a fresh belt. The attack resumed. Another wave of Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle. They'd learned from the first attempt. This time they came in short rushes, using terrain for cover, advancing in bounds. It was smarter tactics, but it didn't matter. Basilone waited until they were closer, then opened fire again. The machine gun was brutally effective at short range. Bodies fell in heaps. The attack stalled. The Japanese pulled back to regroup. Basilone's platoon commander came to check the position. He was pleased. The guns had stopped the first. 2 attacks cleanly. Casualties were light. Ammunition expenditure was acceptable. The commander told Basilone to hold the line and moved to check other positions. Basilone knew this was just the beginning. The Japanese wouldn't quit after 2 failed attacks. They would keep coming all night, probing for weakness, looking for gaps. His crews needed to pace themselves, conserve energy, stay alert. He rotated men through the positions, let some rest while others stood watch. At midnight, the Japanese came again. This time they brought mortars. Shells began falling around Basilone's position. Not many, just enough to force the Marines to take cover. While the mortars fired, Japanese infantry advanced. They were using the explosions as cover, rushing forward whenever a shell landed near the American line. Basilone ignored the mortars. He stayed at his gun, watching for targets. When the Japanese came within range, he fired. The center gun cut down a dozen men before they could reach the 30 wire. But the mortar fire was accurate. A shell landed directly on the left gun position. The explosion killed the gunner instantly and wounded the assistant gunner. The gun was damaged, barrel blown off, receiver cracked. Basilone ran to the position. The wounded assistant was screaming, holding his leg. Basilone checked him quickly. Shrapnel wounds, bad but not fatal if he got medical attention. Basilone called for a corpsman, then examined the destroyed gun. It was unsalvageable. He stripped the ammunition, carried the belts back to the center position, left the wrecked weapon where it sat, 2 guns now instead of 3. The attacks continued. Wave after wave of Japanese soldiers charged across the clearing. Basilone fired until the barrel glowed, then switched to the right gun while the center gun cooled. He ran between positions in short bursts, staying low, moving fast. The Japanese were everywhere now, not just in front but on both flanks, probing for weak spots. Some broke, through the wire, got close enough to throw grenades. Basilone killed them with his pistol, then returned to the machine gun. By 2 a.m., the right gun's crew was down. The gunner had been shot through the chest. The assistant was wounded in both arms. Basilone took over the gun himself, firing from a kneeling position because the tripod had been shot away. He fired until the ammunition ran out, then made a run back to the ammunition pit through Japanese small arms fire. He grabbed 2 belts, slung them over his shoulders, ran back. A Japanese soldier stepped out of the shadows. Basilone shot him without breaking stride, reached the gun position, reloaded, resumed firing. He was operating 2 machine guns now by himself, center and right positions. Both crews were casualties. The Marine riflemen nearby were focused on their own sectors. Nobody could help him. Basilone developed a system. Fire the right gun for 30 seconds until the barrel began to overheat. Run to the center gun. Fire for 30 seconds. Run back to the right. Keep rotating to let the barrels cool slightly between bursts. It wasn't sustainable. The barrels were degrading from thermal stress, but it was working. The Japanese couldn't break through as long as the guns kept firing. At 3 a.m., the center gun jammed. A ruptured cartridge case stuck in the chamber. Basilone tried to clear it with the cleaning rod, but the case was wedged tight. He needed tools, needed light, needed time. He had none of those things. He abandoned the center gun, returned to the right gun, kept firing. Now he was down to one weapon. The right gun had to hold. If it failed, the entire position would collapse. The Japanese would pour through the gap, and Henderson Field would fall. Basilone fired in controlled bursts, conserving ammunition, making every round count. His hands were burned from touching hot metal. His shoulders ached from the recoil. His ears were ringing so badly he could barely hear, but he kept firing. The Japanese kept dying. At some point, he ran out of water for the cooling jacket. The gun was supposed to be water-cooled, but the water had boiled away, and there was no time to refill it. The gun was now air-cooled by default, operating far beyond its design limits. The barrel was cherry red. Any second it could warp or split. Basilone reduced his rate of fire, short bursts only, gave the barrel time to cool between shots. It held together. At 4 a.m., Basilone realized he was out of ammunition at the gun position. The belts he'd been feeding were empty. More ammunition was in the pit, 75 yards behind him, but getting there meant crossing open ground under fire. He had no choice. He left the gun, sprinted toward the ammunition pit. Japanese rifles cracked, bullets kicked up mud around his feet. He reached the pit, grabbed as many belts as he could carry, draped them across his body like bandoliers. He must have been carrying 70 or 80 pounds of ammunition. He ran back toward his position. Halfway there, a Japanese machine gun opened fire from the tree line. Basilone hit the ground, crawled the last 30 yards, dragging the ammunition belts through the mud. He reached the right gun, loaded a fresh belt, resumed firing. The Japanese machine gun that had shot at him was visible now, muzzle flashes giving away its position. Basilone adjusted his aim, walked his fire toward the enemy gun. A burst of 30 caliber rounds silenced it. Dawn was coming. The Japanese attacks were losing momentum. They'd been assaulting the position for 7 hours straight. Their casualties were staggering. Bodies littered the clearing in piles 3 and 4 deep. The survivors were exhausted, disorganized, falling back to regroup. Basilone kept firing, short bursts, aimed shots, making sure no Japanese soldier got close enough to threaten the line. By 6 a.m., the shooting stopped. The Japanese had withdrawn completely. The battlefield was silent, except for the moans of wounded men and the hiss of Basilone's overheated machine gun barrel cooling in the morning air. Basilone stood up. His legs nearly gave out. He'd been fighting for 9 hours without rest. His hands were blistered and bleeding. His uniform was soaked with sweat and mud and blood, though he didn't know if the blood was his or someone else's. He looked around his position. The 2 functioning machine guns were both destroyed. Barrels warped, receivers cracked, mechanisms seized from overheating. The center gun he'd abandoned was still jammed. The left gun that had been hit by the mortar was scrap metal. His entire section's weapons were ruined. But they had done their job. The line had held. Henderson Field was still in American hands. Basilone's platoon commander arrived at dawn to assess the position. He stopped and stared. The scene was carnage beyond anything he'd seen. Japanese bodies were everywhere, stacked in piles where they'd fallen under machine gun fire. Commander counted quickly. Over 200 Japanese dead directly in front of Basilone's position, more out in the clearing where they'd been hit during the charges. The estimate would later reach close to 300 enemy killed or wounded by Basilone's guns alone. The commander asked Basilone what happened. Basilone explained briefly. Crews were casualties. Guns overheated. He'd operated them himself, rotated between positions, kept them firing. The commander asked how long he'd been fighting alone. Basilone wasn't sure. Maybe 5 hours. Maybe more. Time had blurred during the battle. The commander looked at the destroyed weapons, at the mountains of spent brass, at the exhausted sergeant standing in front of him. He said he was putting Basilone in for a commendation. Basilone said his crews deserved recognition, the men who died at their guns. The commander said they would all be recognized, but Basilone had done something extraordinary. Holding that position alone had prevented a breakthrough that could have lost Henderson Field. The full story emerged slowly, as other survivors reported what they'd seen. Marines from adjacent positions described watching Basilone run between guns under fire, carrying ammunition, operating weapons by himself. They'd assumed he would be killed. Nobody could survive that level of exposure. But Basilone had kept moving, kept shooting, kept the line intact through pure determination. A corpsman who'd treated wounded men at the position said Basilone had made at least 10 trips to the ammunition pit during the night. Each trip was across 75 yards of open ground with Japanese soldiers firing at him. The corpsman had watched one trip where Basilone was so loaded with ammunition belts he could barely run. He'd stumbled twice, got up both times, made it back to his gun, kept fighting. The ammunition expenditure was analysed later. Basilone's section had fired approximately 26,000 rounds during the night. Most of that came from the 2 guns. Basilone operated himself during the final hours. 26,000 rounds was an extraordinary amount of sustained fire. It represented barrel changes, water refills, constant reloading, and maintenance under combat conditions. The fact that Basilone had kept the guns running at all was remarkable. That he'd done it largely alone was unprecedented. The Japanese casualties told their own story. Post-war analysis of Japanese records confirmed that the main assault against Henderson Field had been concentrated against the sector Basilone defended. The Japanese 29th Infantry Regiment had attacked with over 3,000 men. Their casualties in that sector exceeded 800, killed and wounded. A significant portion of those casualties were attributed directly to machine gun fire from Basilone's position. The numbers were staggering. In roughly 9 hours of combat, one Marine sergeant had inflicted casualties that would have required an entire company under normal circumstances. The ratio of ammunition to kills suggested that Basilone's fire had been accurate and disciplined despite the chaos. He hadn't simply fired wildly into the darkness. He'd aimed, adjusted, made every burst count. Military historians would later study the action as an example of defensive firepower at its most effective. Machine guns were force multipliers, but only if used correctly. Basilone had positioned his weapons perfectly, used terrain to maximize their effectiveness, and maintained fire discipline even under extreme pressure. The result was a killing zone that the Japanese could not cross. But there was another element beyond tactics and firepower. Basilone had simply refused to quit. When his crews were killed, he kept fighting. When his weapons overheated, he improvised solutions. When ammunition ran low, he went and got more. When the situation became impossible, he made it possible through sheer willpower. That quality, that refusal to accept defeat, was what separated exceptional combat leaders from ordinary ones. The battle for Henderson Field continued for another day. The Japanese launched more attacks on October 25th, but they were smaller, less coordinated. The Americans held every position. By October 26th, the Japanese offensive had failed. General Hyakutake ordered his surviving forces to withdraw into the jungle. He'd lost over 4,000 men trying to capture Henderson Field. The Marines had lost fewer than 300. It was a crushing defeat for the Japanese, a decisive victory for the Americans. Guadalcanal would remain in American hands. The island campaign would drag on for another 3 months, but Henderson Field would never again be seriously threatened. October's battles had broken Japanese offensive capability. They would fight defensively from that point forward, gradually being pushed back until their final evacuation in February 1943. For the Marines who defended Henderson Field, October 1942, became legendary. The 7th Marines had stopped the largest Japanese assault of the campaign through firepower, coordination, and individual courage. Basilone's stand became the symbol of that defense. One Marine holding an impossible position had epitomized what the entire regiment had accomplished. The immediate aftermath for Basilone was medical attention. His hands required treatment for burns and lacerations. He had minor shrapnel wounds he hadn't noticed during the fighting. The corpsman treated him, gave him water, tried to get him to rest. Basilone refused to leave his position until his weapons were replaced. He spent October 26th scavenging parts from damaged machine guns, rebuilding his section's weapons. He gathered ammunition, restocked his pits, prepared for the next attack. His platoon commander had to order him to stand down, to get real sleep in a dry tent instead of a muddy foxhole. Then, Basilone slept with his pistol loaded and within arm's reach. The medals and recognition came later. In December 1942, Basilone was recommended for the Medal of Honor. The citation described his actions on October 24th and 25th, how he'd fought against savage enemy attacks, how he'd repaired guns under fire, how he'd risked his life repeatedly to keep ammunition flowing, how he'd held a critical position when its capture would have meant disaster. The Medal of Honor was approved in early 1943. Basilone was pulled off Guadalcanal, sent back to the United States for the award ceremony. He met with senior officers, gave interviews to newspapers, attended public events. The Marine Corps used him for recruitment and morale purposes. Here was a living hero, proof that individual Marines could accomplish extraordinary things. Basilone hated the attention. He was uncomfortable with praise, embarrassed by the ceremony. He told reporters that he'd just done his job, that any Marine would have done the same. He said the real heroes were the men who'd died, the crews who'd stayed at their guns until killed. He wanted to go back to his unit, back to combat. The Marine Corps wouldn't allow it. Basilone was too valuable as a symbol. They assigned him to war bond tours, to training bases, to recruiting stations. He spent a year in the United States, traveling, speaking, appearing at rallies. He raised millions of dollars for the war effort. He inspired thousands of young men to enlist, but he was miserable. This wasn't what he'd joined the Marines to do. In 1944, Basilone requested repeatedly to return to combat duty. He finally received permission. He was assigned to the 5th Marine Division, preparing for the invasion of Iwo Jima. He arrived at Camp Pendleton in California, joined Company C, 1st Battalion, 27th Marines, as a machine gun platoon sergeant. His new unit knew who he was. Medal of Honor, recipient. Guadalcanal hero, the man who'd single-handedly held Henderson Field. Some Marines were intimidated, others were inspired. Basilone just wanted to be treated like any other platoon sergeant. He trained his men the same way he'd trained on Guadalcanal, relentlessly, obsessively. He drilled them on weapon maintenance, tactical positioning, ammunition management. He made them practice everything under the worst conditions because he knew combat would be worse than any training. In December 1944, while on leave, Basilone married Lena Riggi, a Marine sergeant he'd met at Camp Pendleton. She was a field cook, one of the women Marines serving in support roles. They had 10 days together before Basilone shipped out for Iwo Jima. He told her he'd come back. She believed him because she had to. The 5th Marine Division landed on Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945. Basilone went ashore in the first wave. The beach was chaos. Japanese artillery and mortars hammered the landing zones. Marines went to ground, pinned down by fire they couldn't see. Basilone's platoon was supposed to move inland, get off the beach, establish positions. But the volcanic sand made movement impossible. Men sank to their knees, equipment bogged down, tanks were stuck. The entire assault was stalling on the beach. Basilone saw the problem. A Japanese bunker was firing directly down the beach approach route. It was a reinforced concrete position, impervious to small arms fire. It needed to be destroyed, or the Marines would be trapped. Basilone gathered a demolition team, 4 men with satchel charges and flamethrowers. He led them up the beach toward the bunker. Japanese machine gun fire swept across their position. Basilone moved from cover to cover, directing his team, calling out targets. They reached the bunker, placed charges, destroyed it. The route inland was clear. Marines began moving off the beach. Basilone led his platoon forward. They were advancing toward Airfield No. 1 when Japanese mortars began falling. The barrage was intense, shells landing every few seconds. Basilone was moving between his machine gun teams, coordinating their positions, when a mortar shell exploded directly on his position. The explosion killed him instantly. It was February 19th, 1945, 9 a.m. John Basilone had been on Iwo Jima for less than 6 hours. He was 27 years old. He died leading his men forward under fire, doing exactly what he'd been trained to do. His death shocked the 5th Marine Division. Word spread quickly through the regiment. Manila John was gone. The man who'd survived Guadalcanal, who'd held Henderson Field alone, who'd come back for more, had been killed on a volcanic island thousands of miles from home. Basilone's body was recovered the next day. He was buried temporarily in the 5th Marine Division cemetery on Iwo Jima. After the battle, his remains were returned to the United States. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. His widow, Lena, received his Medal of Honor and Navy Cross. She never remarried. She kept his memory alive for the rest of her life. The legacy of John Basilone extended far beyond his death. Military instructors taught his methods for positioning machine guns, managing ammunition, maintaining fire under pressure. His willingness to improvise, to take control when the situation deteriorated, became an example of combat leadership. But more than tactics, Basilone represented something fundamental about the Marine Corps: the refusal to quit, the determination to hold ground regardless of cost, the willingness to stand alone if necessary. Those qualities were what made Marines effective. Basilone had embodied them completely. In Raritan, New Jersey, Basilone's hometown built a memorial. A parade was held annually in his honor. His family kept his story alive. His brothers and sisters talked about the boy from Buffalo who became a Marine hero. His nieces and nephews grew up hearing stories about Uncle John, who'd gone to war and never came home. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.